Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on Inflection Point Podcast. Well, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us in the newest episode of Inflection Point Podcast. I am your host, Anita Russell, and as always, it's my pleasure to have Mavis and Gail, the co-hosts, say a quick hello.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mavis Bauman.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome to our conversation this evening.
Excellent, excellent. And it is going to be a very good conversation. If you were with us in the last couple of episodes where we talked about the issue of Black farming, right? So back in November, we did 2 episodes. One episode, we talked about Black farming in general. And then the second episode, we actually had a Black urban farmer join us as our guest and talk about some of her experiences. Today, we're going to take a look at it from a more global perspective. So again, if you've been following us for a while, you know that sometimes we'll do an episode where we talk about being Black globally. And this is one of those episodes. So we're going to talk about the plight of Black farmers in South Africa. And so there might be a question in your mind, well, like, what is the big deal? The big deal is that, quite frankly, there are a lot of parallels between the farming issues, particularly from a racialized historical perspective, that have occurred in the United States and that of South Africa. So one of the things that we kind of really emphasize on our show is this idea of historical literacy. So we always kind of bring that historical perspective into the whole entire thing. And so this episode is no different. And if you joined us, as I mentioned on the previous episode, we talked from a historical perspective. We talk about the 40 acres and a mule promise, which was never realized. We talked about Reconstruction, kind of that period coming out of the Civil War and how that related to Black codes, Jim Crow, the Great Migration. And what all of that did for farmers is that it created a footprint of mistrust between Black farmers and, in particular, the U.S. government. And so one of the things that we shared is that from a contemporary perspective, just very recently, there was a class action lawsuit filed against the U.S. government, the USDA specifically, on behalf of Black and brown farmers. And there's a particular quote that I want to say, and then I want to open it up a little bit to Mavis and Gail to provide some feedback as well. So this comes from a report that noted that the debt that Black farmers were consistently accruing cost them millions of acres, which white buyers were able to just kind of snap it up. So here's the quote: "If you are Black and you're born south of the Mason-Dixon line and you try to farm, you have been discriminated against. And this is a quote from Lloyd Wright, the director of the USDA Office of Civil Rights under Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and he's a Black Virginia farmer. So I'd like to hear a little bit from Mavis and Gail, your thoughts on this whole idea of, you know, here we are in the United States with this historical legacy. And then when you look at South Africa from that land perspective, from that farming perspective, there's a lot of similarities there.
Yes, I'll go ahead. There are a lot of similarities. The themes are, you know, everything's going to be fine, but we'll take this land here and we're going to farm it, and you move over there, and then you're limited to staying there, and then you're blocked from income, and then there's disastrous income inequality. And you know, in reading about South Africa more, I'm just, you know, kind of, as always, amazed that I didn't see that at the time that I was standing up against apartheid, you know, in the 80s. I just never thought about the parallels in the United States. But I just wasn't exposed to a lot of it. So that's part of it. But it's the same problem around the world. Same problem. White supremacy and holding down people of color.
Right. That's right. It is amazing. The more that I read about it, the more parallel issues I could see. And it's almost like the government set up the Black farmers, whether it was in the United States or even in South Africa, to fail. And they set up the white farmers to be able to have all that they needed to be able to not just survive, but to really create wealth for themselves and begin to do a more of the kind of farming that's going to become more commercialized and being able to export the produce and so forth. And the Black farmers never had a chance to be able, one, they didn't have the education, they didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the financial backing of the government that the white people did. I mean, it's just, whether look at South Africa or America, and the same thing has happened and still is happening.
And so what both of these scenarios show us is that land is power.
Mm-hmm.
In both of these societies, whether you're looking at the United States or you're looking at South Africa, it's centered on this idea that land is power. And Mavis, you mentioned this whole thing of white supremacy. So white supremacy is real. It's not just this thing that exists in one part of the world and not in another part of the world. And something else that you mentioned, Mavis, as and I think we talked about this before as we were preparing for the show, how in the 80s and the 90s in the United States, there was so much protesting and you know, we
divesting.
Need this. Yes, divesting, and
picketing
all of that
about apartheid. And you know, I was in Omaha, and I was in a community of a lot more Black people than I had ever been before. And I had no idea what they were dealing with at the same time in my own state, in my college town. It's just amazing to think about. It's, yeah.
Exactly. So when I think about that now in the work that I do currently, anti-racism and all of that, and it just really screams so loudly to me, the hypocrisy. We want to go and tell someone else, like, this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this, races should not be separated, people should not have to have a pass to, you know, prove that you're allowed or supposed to be in this particular region versus that particular region. I mean, think about that. It would be like in the United States, if I had to have this pass that said I can only be in the city of Pittsburgh, and if I go to the city of New York, I can be arrested.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, just really thinking about that and just not even realize in the language, the word apartheid
Yeah.
means apart. It
Apartness.
means segregated,
Yeah.
right? And we lived through Jim Crow. We lived through Black codes. We lived through Jim Crow. We lived through real life segregation, Montgomery, Alabama, Selma, you know, the march, and all, we lived all of that.
Yeah.
Right. You know, at first when I was reading about the South Africa, it was so blatant what they did. I mean, and how they did this that I kept thinking, well, it wasn't quite that blatant here. And yet I look back at it, of course it was. It's just that people didn't want to see it. The white supremacy was so prevalent that, and the messages were, don't look at that, don't think about, don't talk about that, right? But it was all right there in the same similar way that it's done in South Africa, and as blatant. You know?
Yeah. I took that just, I'm sorry, Gail, go ahead.
I was going to say that they gave, when they finally gave land to the Black farmers, they gave white people this lush land. It was free, and they gave the Black farmers a desert land without any access to water, without any access to seeds. I mean, it's just appalling.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mavis, you were going to say?
Well, my thought went away. I'll come up with it here in a minute. Sorry.
Oh,
So
okay.
go ahead.
No,
I know what it was. I know what it was.
Good.
Gail was talking about people not seeing what was going on. And I think I said this when we were preparing also, that I feel like I was blind. Not even a choice was involved. That my socialization put me into a kind of blindness, so that I didn't ask the question, why aren't there Black farmers in Nebraska? You know, I was blind to their conscripted opportunities. It was just not in the air and where I grew up. And so I was blind, and still am to a lot, but we're getting over that. Yeah, this historical illiteracy is the thing.
Right, exactly. And what you just said, that being blind, that was part of the way it was set up. It was set up for you to be blind, all of this. And I think one of the things that it's so hard when, you know, when we're having these conversations about systems that are in place and institutions that are in place, it just kind of blows my mind sometimes that we talk, or even like economics, right? We talk about it as if these systems are spontaneously generated. Like they just poof, came out of the air, and poof, we have this capitalistic system, poof, we have this racialized world that we live in. No, it was created. It came out of the hearts and the thoughts and the thinking of human beings. We created all of this.
Right.
And then act like we have to just react to it. The economy has a life of its own, and we have no ability to affect it.
Exactly.
And to give people more opportunities.
Right. No accountability, responsibility. Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's change our discussion a little bit and actually dig into some of those historical elements in South Africa. So the first thing that we want to talk about is going back to 1913, right? And even though this is we're starting this conversation in 1913, there's a lot more history before that. We're just kind of starting at this particular moment in time because it's relevant more to the contemporary apartheid system that we're familiar with. Right. And so in 1913 was the Land Act. And the Land Act prohibited Black people from buying or renting land in areas that were designated as white. But doesn't that sound familiar? You can't.
Right.
Yeah.
Not in my backyard, not in my neighborhood.
Right.
Redlining.
Right. All of it, right?
It all kind of meshes together, right? So this legislation was one of the cornerstones of apartheid, and it paved the way for further legislation restricting the rights of Black people and their ownership of land. In order to fulfill this legislation, the government took measures to forcibly, hear
Literally,
that,
right.
forcibly remove Black people from areas that had been set aside for white people. So just kind of let that sink in.
And they literally moved them with a
They
truck.
destroyed their homes, right?
That's
Right.
right.
So
Without
this is
notice.
right. Exactly. So
One morning
this
and
is
having
stolen land.
right. Just
This is stolen land. How is that any different from when the Pilgrims came to the United States and there were already people that were living here and those individuals
right,
ended
right.
up being displaced? How is it different? It's the same kind of mindset, the same kind of thinking.
The same view, belief around white supremacy, that they had a right to do whatever they wanted to move people away from their homes that they lived in for decades, right? And without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
And that the one they took the mixed community of Black and white people, and they literally moved the entire
Yes.
community. I mean,
Yes, yes.
but
So
how?
then in 1923, the native urban areas that took effect, this law allowed for white local authority to control the influx of Blacks in their areas, and it gave them powers to remove Africans who were not allowed in a particular area. So then it gets back to this whole idea of having a pass. And this pass,
And an ID, right? Didn't they have to have IDs too?
well, that's what the pass was. It was
Yeah.
this. I mean, think
Okay.
about it. Think
It's like
about it.
Rwanda.
Well, let's even go deeper than that.
Okay.
In the United States, under slavery, if you were caught on the road without the right papers, that your master gave you some kind of papers that said you were allowed to be on that road going to this place over here, you could find yourself literally in hot water. It's all about controlling where you're allowed to move about, right? And so in South Africa, it was this past when so you all know my brother is an actor, right? And when he was an undergrad, he did this play called oh my gosh, what was the name of it? Sizwe Bonzi is Dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a play that it was set in South Africa. As a matter of fact, the play was written by the South African playwright Wole Soyinka. I think I'm saying his name correctly. But the whole entire theme of the show was this gentleman by the name, this Black South African by the name of Sizwe Bonzi dies. And he's got his papers are on him, right? So there's another Black South African that is in the township where Sizwe Bonzi lives, but he doesn't have papers. And so this conversation ensues about whether or not for his safety and for him to be able to get back to where he needs to go, should he take Sizwe Bonzi's papers? And if he gets stopped along the way, he's got these papers that he can show. It was a very interesting example of how,
example.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, of how people have to figure out how to manage that on a day-to-day basis.
Something that we don't think about ever.
I just keep hearing in my ears, liberty and justice for all. Liberty and justice for all.
Exactly.
No.
Exactly. Exactly. So then we get to 1936, and there's an amendment to the 1913 Land Act, which is called the Native Trust Land Act. And it basically widened the authority and the reach, if you will, of the 1913 Act. Then we get to the 1950s, and this is the Group Areas Act. And this is where we talked about the architect, the young architect from that was
Right.
born and raised in South Africa. And I think this is the correct pronunciation on his name, Wandile Mitiyani, right? And so he and his neighbors kind of found themselves living in this settlement deliberately designed to separate Black people, not just from one another, but to separate them from growth and to separate them from opportunity. And this all arose as a result of this Group Areas Act of 1950. And this is how it's described. It was a tool used by the apartheid government to squash the existence of mixed race communities and instead assign mixed race communities and instead assign where people would live based on their race, right? And so what this created was a labor camp called townships, which were designed, and this is where the architectural aspect comes into it. It was designed based on this 40-40 rule, which meant that the homes were built, what a lot of us have seen, these homes that we have come to use the term shanties, right? When some of the images from South Africa, 40 square meters was the home, and placed them 40 kilometers away from the city, which then forced the Black people to spend 40% of their income commuting to work. This effectively rendered these communities incapable of developing their homes and their communities.
Or accumulating any wealth as individual families.
Right. And the only time they were allowed to go to the city was to work. And as soon as they're done working, they had to leave. That's the thing about that 40-minute drive, wasn't it? All their money was going towards, I mean, yeah.
No services either, right? They didn't have like water pumped in, sanitation services. I mean, you look at those Black townships and you know those people are just scraping together a life. Yeah.
So even, even recent, and when I say recent, I'm referring, Mavis, to 2008, when you and I had the opportunity to travel to South Africa. And just think about some of the places that we went to. We were in Escort, Ezekwini, Ladysmith, all of these places where you could see the disparities that were there.
Just these tiny structures, just a cement slab, basically a tin roof, and nothing else but each other. That's really all they had to help survive. And we visited the woman who wasn't even able to walk and was sick with breast cancer. And you just think that life can't get any rougher, and it does. It does. And they're just locked away from those services, ability to get to healthcare, to a doctor.
Yeah. So we had that experience, right? But now, as we dig deeper, as we're having this conversation about property rights under apartheid, you can see that it was structured that way. It was purposely designed that way. Not that different from the United States.
No.
When you think about the South, when you think back on all of those images that you've seen of the housing structures that the slaves lived in, and then even coming out of that, going into Reconstruction, all of these images that you see of these people just living in these quarters.
It's incredible.
Are subhuman, subpar, but by design.
Yeah.
by design. Again, this wasn't spontaneously generated. It wasn't generated because Black people don't have a sense of, like, I'd like to have running water like these people over here have running water, or I'd like to,
Or
you
didn't
know,
have the ability to
right, exactly, exactly. And
build
so,
any of the above. Yeah.
yeah, so this whole idea that somehow it's because we're defective as people, we're defective as human beings, that these are the conditions that we somehow choose to live in. No.
Yeah.
Not what happened.
No.
That is such an important point for people to
Yeah.
hear. I can just tell you that that is a common belief in my part of the country. I
No
can
one would
promise
choose.
you. I can
No one
promise
would
you.
ever choose to live that way. No one would.
No.
Not
It's one of
anyone.
my earliest memories, actually. My family drove down to Florida. So I'm not sure exactly what route we took, but I saw, a home of a Black family, just unimaginable to me. And I was 5, and I remember it. All the people sitting on the porch, nothing to do, blocked from all kinds of opportunity. Anyway, that just keeps coming up for me. It's real, man.
Yeah,
Real.
it's definitely real.
Yeah.
And it's worth talking about, having
Yes.
conversations about.
Mm.
So the
Right.
other thing that I will mention, in terms of these milestones, if you will, 1951 was the passing of the Prevention of Illegal Squatters Act. And it was a law that gave magistrates the power. Now, just listen to this and let it sink in. That gave magistrates the power to remove Black homes, Blacks, and demolish their housing structures without prior knowledge. And then there was another thing that it was connected to that Native Lands Act of 1913 that was amended in 1964 to allow the abolition of labor tenancy by means of proclamation. And what that meant was that Black tenants on white farms could now be classified as squatters. And if you're classified as a squatter, now you fall under this power to be removed and have your home demolished without prior notice.
Right. Perfect setup, isn't it?
Yeah.
Perfect setup.
It is to continue keeping the whole belief system of the country, right, in exactly the way it was, even though the quote slaves were free.
Right.
That freedom didn't exist.
Right.
Right.
No.
Exactly. So now you can see those parallels. So we're at that midpoint of our program, and we're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, we will continue this important discussion. Welcome back to Inflection Point podcast, where we are having a conversation about being Black globally, the plight of Black farmers in South Africa. So we've been having a bit of a historical literacy discussion about the importance of really understanding current events and thinking about where we want to go in the future. But you have to do that by reflecting on the past and having that knowledge of the past to be able to say, well, what were those stepping stones that's got us here? Because if you don't understand that past, you can't really repair the present, so to speak. So let's talk a little bit about agricultural apartheid in South Africa. So there is an article. It was an article that I picked up, and the article is centered around the promised land, how South Africa's Black farmers were set up to fail. So this is a lot of stuff that we've already been talking about. But while we were on break, something in the article just really caught my eye that I'd like to kind of throw out there. So this is in 1994, Nelson Mandela has been inaugurated as the country's first Black president. And he gripped the hand of, you all remember that picture of him shaking hands with F.W. de Klerk, and basically saying in the Afrikaans language, what is verbi, what is past is past. So let's put the past behind us and let's just kind of move forward, right? And these words had expressed a hope for the country's transition, that the right attitudes, repentance from white people, and forgiveness from people of color, the damage that segregation had done could be left in the past, right?
Mm.
Then the article goes on to say that it's still very problematic, okay? Because it says it was also felt like a dread was hanging over the country. So even though there was some improvements, there was still this heaviness that was hanging over the country. And in one newspaper, a letter was written by a Black South African who warned that the country's level of dissatisfaction would soon make the burning of Mississippi, the unrest in the Jim Crow era American South, look like a bonfire. Yeah. And again, it's that connection between what happens in the United States versus what happened, some of the things that happen in South Africa. So what, Mavis Gail, what is your response to that?
I'll follow you, Gail.
Well, I mean, what has changed, right? I mean, you can't just write a law and say, okay, now we're going to say everything's passed, right? Because the reality, whether it was in the United States or it was in South Africa, these are people, human beings that have been living under such an oppressive, controlling life environment, right? That how are they going to change? What were they going to be given in order to make those changes? And how are they going to be educated enough to be able to do that, right? And they weren't.
And I think a lot of it also connects to, like, if you think about where the perspective that we come from with Inflection Point podcast, it is based on this idea of cultivating change from the inside out.
Right.
So if all you have are a group of people or a group of legislators coming together and they're trying to make this work legalistically and they're trying to, amend the laws and everything like that, but the basic tenets of white supremacy and racism are still there. So I'm going to read this portion of this same article. Apartheid leaders had tried to carve South Africa into multiple countries. Just let that sink in. Try to carve South Africa into multiple countries. A white country and a handful of Black homelands, which they insisted were completely different sovereign nations. Politically, that was always a farce. The homelands had puppet rulers and no local economies. They commanded little loyalty among their so-called citizens, and most of their residents still commuted to white areas to work.
Nothing changed, right?
Nothing changed.
No, you can put the wording in however you want to, but that does not create that change.
Exactly.
And they were just creating segregation. I mean, right? They were still just to find a different way to say the same thing that they always had been saying.
If you think about being a leader during that time, I mean, I can imagine, of course, I'm referring to the genocide in Rwanda, but how do you just stop things and try to start over? You may have to put in systems like that, but to deny the past, those systems are going to fail.
Right.
And the undercurrent is still there. the hatred for each other, the rage at how they've been treated, everything is still there.
Everything is still there.
Yeah.
Everything that was in the heart of white South Africans, for the most part, remains still there, because I don't know, somebody is this famous quote that you can't legislate morality.
Yeah.
You can't just change a law and expect that that law is going to change a person's heart any more than when you do so-called diversity training in a corporate America. It's just training. Like, you could train a dog to do a new trick, but it's still a dog, right? And so you could train these people that, you know, this is what we want, this is what diversity looks like, blah, 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 and all of that. But if they're not being challenged to change themselves from the inside out and to change who they are as human beings in their thinking towards other people, they're thinking towards themselves. Do I think of myself as being up here and everybody else is down here? If you're not willing to examine that, acknowledge that it's there,
absolutely,
and then make a commitment that I'm going to change that, then you just end up with the same soup warmed over.
That's right.
And if you keep warming the soup over, you just end up with spoiled soup.
And people that are getting progressively angrier. That's right. You know, it's that has just not gone away. You know, I pulled another sentence from that same article that struck me, that apartheid was the most rigid form of legalized racial segregation history has ever known. As segregation deepened through the 20th century, this is what I think you were talking about, Gail, much of the fertile, rain-washed land had been given to the white people, while the barren peaks and hot, dry, malaria-ridden lowland were given to Black tribal leaders.
Tell me where there's not segregation in that statement, right? In that
well, how do they justify that? How do they justify
white supremacy? I mean,
well, you know, a history of colonialism, and then I'm going to make it so you really can't survive.
Right. You're really not going to succeed. Don't ever think you're going to be as good as we are if your skin is white, right?
Right. And then that also introduces the conversation around subsistence farming versus commercial farming. Because commercial farming is, you know, white farmers being able to raise their crops, and now they can be involved in exporting, you know, what they're producing to other countries and all of that. And so now the wealth just continues, right? The wealth continues. But if you're trying to work a land that the way you just described it, and that land cannot be productive on the same level as a commercial farmer, again, you've been set up to fail miserably. And then
nobody's going to loan you money either to try.
Right. And then people point the finger and see those Black folks, they don't know how to farm. They don't know how to farm.
Which is so ludicrous given the fact that they've been working the lands everywhere forever.
Right. Exactly. So it's just such an interesting view, or an interesting events that we're now being confronted with, and really being able to have these types of conversations about it. And so one of the articles is about, the title is "Agricultural Apartheid is Alive and Well in South Africa, and there are 14 million people who are hungry."
Right, because what they described that happened when they received the land that was very barren, and they didn't have any water filtration. They didn't have any means of really farming that land. And what little they could do could never compete against the white farmers who had these lush lands and were doing the commercialized farming and making more money and more money. And so eventually the farmers just stopped, right?
And the food was exported on top of everything else.
Yeah, exactly. That's a whole other phase of
whole other level of robbery in a way, you know?
Yeah, the article about Wandile, the young man that became an architect, and I mean, he was trying to correct what was really needed, which was right. He got his degree in the United States, came back. He designed a place for this one couple that were both disabled, and he built a daycare center into that house so they could sustain themselves. And then they did. And not only did they sustain themselves, but they actually increased the number of kids they could actually have and grew. And
So
that's
their
what happened.
their income is increased and their ability to stay. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
I just
Exactly.
want brains like that in more places. You know, what I think I was just watching a video of him tonight, and he said, you have to ask the people there.
Yeah.
You have to. Oh, I know what he was talking about. Housing systems for poorer communities all over the world. If you just build something and put them in it, it's going to be unsuccessful because it doesn't meet their needs culturally, in terms of how they relate to each other, distance from work, all of those things. Not just here's a house. Why aren't you grateful? That's not going to
Exactly.
work.
And if you think about in the United States under the housing authority with the building of projects, it was the
That's
same
what I'm
kind of,
talking about. Exactly.
same kind of,
Exactly.
same exact conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And those projects became nightmares for people.
Yes.
With
Yes.
broken elevators.
Yes.
You know, they put them all up in the air and then they can't even, oh my goodness.
And so it's this idea that you're claiming that you want to provide affordable housing for me, but then as you're creating your designs for that affordable housing, I'm not even involved in the conversation.
Yeah, right.
I'm not in. That's what this gentleman, Wandili, is doing. He's involving people in the conversation. What do you want? And how can I help you to get what you want? If an individual can do that, but the government cannot.
Just a young kid. Yeah. Yeah. We just need some creative thinkers, and we need to, as in terms of people in power, let go of the reins a little bit. The solutions are out there.
Right.
All kinds of forms, like you say, in terms of racism, but in terms of housing, in terms of working the land, all kinds of things. The women's organizations that we became familiar with when we were in South Africa, they know what they want to do with the land. Yeah.
So here's a good example of exactly what you were saying. The Black Farmers Association of South Africa. So when we had our conversation about the plight of US farmers, we found that there are multiple Black Farmers Associations that exist in the United States. So in South Africa, they have the Black Farmers Association of South Africa. And when you first go on their website, the first thing you see is land is power, right? And then it says they were formed in 2015. The association was established to benefit Black farmers, especially in South Africa, where only whites, coloreds, and Indians derive meaningful benefit from government funding and support programs. You could literally take that and lift it up and put it into the documents in the United States. It's the same conversation. I know I keep saying that, but I want to make sure that people really understand it is the same.
It's important. It's important.
Absolutely.
To just hear it again and again.
Then it goes on to say, let me just read this little bit and then you can jump in, Mavis. Black African people ownership of land is not equitable. They rely on small scale farming of both crops and mixed range of livestock. The Black Farmers Association of South Africa strives to ensure that Black farmers benefit from government subsidies, land reform, and acquisition programs, including skills transfer and provision of farming implements to reach a full-fledged commercial trading status. That's
what's needed. Yes.
It is what is needed. Exactly.
Yeah.
So Mavis, you were getting ready to make a point, I believe.
Yeah, it's sort of a big topic, but we were talking about the white supremacy that overlays this whole story. And I just want listeners to be careful about how you hear those words. This is something that is so big, so deep, and so broad that we can address it, but I don't want people to shrink from it. I think that's what I'm getting at.
Absolutely.
Don't shrink from identifying the root of all of these problems.
Right.
That people who thought they were racially superior took what wasn't theirs.
Exactly.
And
so it's really
well from themselves.
Right. So in light of what you just said, it's really important for people to understand that white supremacy is a system. It's an ideology. It's a belief system.
Right.
Right. And so I heard a gentleman that I was interviewing very recently, and he made the statement that white supremacy doesn't equal white people. So when we talk about white
that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, we're talking about that system, that institutionalized, structured system that was designed to benefit white people. But when we talk about we want to eradicate white supremacy, that doesn't mean we want to wipe out white people. That's not what we're saying.
That's exactly where I wanted this to go. So thank you.
It's the system. It's that system and all of the things that are connected to that is what we want to dismantle and create a system that is equitable for everyone to benefit from.
To do that, we have to help everyone see the truth, right? And see the truth of what created this in order to create something new. And we have to look at how that has infiltrated every possible step of trying to reconstruct or do whatever, because white supremacy and the belief system that holds has always been there and is always going to not be workable. It's not going to be effective, right? Until that system itself, that belief system is changed. And all people have to know and own that we are all truly created equal here.
Exactly. And so it kind of gets into this whole entire thing of just so much of what we're talking about. So I want to read something from one of the articles that we had selected. Whilst white South Africans generally accept majority rule today. So here's a quote. One generation ago, the white supremacist order of apartheid ended in South Africa. The new democratic order has, however, neither delivered a strong economy nor social justice. The white minority generally accepts majority rule, and it's lost its political dominance, but is still privileged in terms of wealth and opportunities.
Yeah.
And so when you think about, we talk about the wealth gap in the United States, there's a wealth gap in South Africa as well. And it's all kind of still related to the fact that white supremacy is prevalent in both of these nations.
Right. I've got a couple of numbers here for you. It's about the South African wealth gap. It says 3,500 adults owning more than the poorest. They own more than the poorest 32 million people in a country of 60 million.
Right.
That's a problem.
Oh, that's a problem. And it says there is no evidence, relating to what you just said, there is no evidence that wealth inequality has decreased since the end of apartheid. That's just heartbreaking. That's just heartbreaking. And
it is.
No surprise to you, right, Anita? No surprise.
No surprise at all. So even when you think about, like, if you go back to when President Obama was elected, and we got our first Black president, and people were saying, oh, this means we're a colorblind country, and we're a post-racial society. No. Because so those were just like these cosmetic types of things, right? But you're not really getting to the heart and the root of the problem and the problem still exists. The problem didn't go away, and now it's just been exacerbated.
Exacerbated, exactly.
Yeah,
Since
exactly.
Obama, yeah.
Right,
Well,
since Obama, since President
Right.
Obama, exactly. Because then
and
we,
politically,
into this whole vortex of problems, and we're still kind of in that vortex of problems.
Yeah.
because the political system is still run by mostly white males.
Yeah.
This
Mhm.
whole political system that we live in, right? Even though we are in a very diversified country, right? It is run mostly by white males.
Oh, I found something on that as well. I think in the Salon article on salon.com that white men are about 30% of the population in American,
Right.
of the population, but hold 62% of public offices, dominating both chambers of Congress, 42 state legislators, and statewide roles across the nation. By contrast, women and people of color constitute 51% and 40% of the US population, respectively, but just 31% and 13% of office holders.
Right.
So whenever that can come into greater balance, I would think, I just am praying we'll see, faster shifts in how this all plays out.
And so I see we're getting flagged, letting us know that we are quickly running out of time. And it seems like we always just run out of time before we finish up the conversation. But there's two things I want to leave with the audience in this last minute or two. Number one, in our next episode, you want to make sure that you are definitely here for that episode, because we actually have a woman from South Africa who will be our guest, and she happens to be she happens to work in corporate philanthropy, number one, but number two, she's also a farmer in South Africa. So she can really, really speak to some of the things that we shared here and some of the problems that are still very much present there. That's number one. And number two, we are hosting the very first annual Anti-Racism Activation Summit in January of 2023. Registration will be opening very soon on December the 12th, and you can go to my website, theplacetosoar.com, and you can get information that you need to get registered. This is really going to be a dynamic event. We have 12 speakers coming from different perspectives and all of that, but all talking about anti-racism activation. So Mavis and Gail, your final words in our last 60 seconds.
I'm just loving this conversation. The parallels are just astounding, and I hope a lot of Americans let that sink in a little bit. So thank you for listening, and we really hope you're here next week or on the 21st.
Yeah, and thank you also for listening and being willing to kind of look inside and to look within that mirror and to see yourself and to see where you've fallen and some of the conversations and issues that we've been looking at and talking about. Because that's the hardest work any of us will ever do. It's the most valuable. Thank you.
So I'm going to leave our audience with this final quote. This is a quote that I've been saying repeatedly. Anti-racism is a process of actively identifying and opposing racism. The goal of anti-racism is to challenge racism and actively change the policies, behaviors, and beliefs that perpetrate racist ideas and action. Anti-racism is rooted in action. So for those of you who joined us and hung in there for this conversation, I thank you. And please visit us the next time on Inflection Point Podcast here on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday of the month, 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time, and we are out. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.